10 experiments that began normally but were never concluded. Across the 20th century, laboratories followed established protocols. Funding was approved. Facilities were secured. Ethics committees signed off. Equipment functioned as designed. In every case, the beginning looked ordinary. Researchers had clear objectives. They knew what they wanted to measure. They knew what results would justify continuation and what would require termination. And yet, scattered across classified archives and discontinued programs, there are experiments that did neither. They were not declared failures. They were not disproven. They did not end in catastrophe. They simply stopped. No final papers, no formal conclusions, no explanations sufficient enough to close the file. In many cases, the data continued to register long after the experiment was supposed to conclude. In others, the subjects themselves changed in ways the protocols had not prepared for. The systems worked. The procedures were followed, but the outcome never arrived. Tonight, Archive 9 examines 10 experiments that began under normal scientific conditions and reached a point where continuation was no longer possible. Not because the equipment failed, not because the subjects resisted, but because something occurred that existing frameworks could not finish explaining. This is not a record of forbidden science. It is a record of research that reached its limits and stopped asking further questions. In the early 1960s, as the United States accelerated its push beyond Earth's atmosphere, a quiet question emerged inside military research circles. What happens to the human mind when gravity is removed completely? Not reduced, not simulated for seconds, but absent. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a sealed research wing was repurposed for an experiment that never received a public designation. Internal documents later refer to it simply as the human zero-G chamber. The chamber itself was cylindrical, magnetically suspended, and isolated from all external reference points. No vibration, no sound bleed, no visible horizon. Once sealed, the interior provided continuous weightlessness without the disorientation caused by parabolic flight. The goal was straightforward. Researchers wanted to measure cognitive stability during prolonged zero-gravity exposure. Reaction time, memory retention, spatial reasoning. The experiment followed established aerospace medical protocols. The first subjects entered for 6-hour intervals. They reported predictable effects: nausea, vertigo, the sensation of falling without movement. Vital signs remained stable. EEG readings showed mild disruption, well within acceptable limits. After 12 hours, the reports changed. Several subjects described difficulty locating their own bodies. Not pain, not panic, a loss of internal reference. One report noted that the subject could no longer tell whether his eyes were open or closed. The data was flagged, but not alarming. At 24 hours, a subject requested termination. When asked why, he struggled to explain. His vitals were normal. His speech was coherent. He eventually said he felt observed, though all monitoring systems confirmed the chamber was empty. The request was denied. By the third trial cycle, exposure was extended to 48 hours. This is where the logs become less precise. One subject described seeing the chamber from above, though no visual input was present. Another showed a complete flattening of EEG activity while remaining conscious, responsive, and able to speak. The supervising physician wrote a single line in the margin of the report: "Neurological state does not match any documented category." After 72 hours, a subject exited the chamber without assistance. He stood unaided. His heart rate was steady. His pupils reacted to light with a measurable delay. When asked what he experienced, he paused before answering. He said there was no sensation of floating. There was no inside, he explained. There was no outside either. Further questioning was discontinued. The chamber was sealed again. The experiment did not resume. Official records list the program as terminated due to operational reallocation. No adverse events were recorded, no injuries reported. But technicians later noted residual electromagnetic fluctuations inside the chamber after shutdown, patterns that matched human neural frequencies, despite the room being empty. The chamber was dismantled in 1965. Most components were reassigned to unrelated research facilities. One element, the central magnetic core, was logged as returned to the manufacturer. The manufacturer had ceased operations years earlier. No follow-up studies were conducted. No long-term evaluations were filed. The human zero-G chamber did not fail. It reached a condition the experiment was not designed to measure. They wanted to understand how humans adapt to weightlessness. Instead, they encountered something more fragile: the boundary that allows a person to know where they end and everything else begins. In the late 1950s, a group of behavioral researchers began investigating a question that appeared simple on paper. What remains of human cognition when all external input is removed? The experiment that was conducted inside a reinforced underground chamber, later referred to in internal files as the sensory deprivation vault. Unlike earlier isolation studies, this facility was designed for absolute control. No light leakage, no sound transmission, no temperature fluctuation. Even airflow was minimized to eliminate directional cues. The vault was not intended to break subjects. It was meant to observe baseline cognition, the mind uninterrupted. Volunteers entered the chamber individually. They lay suspended in a temperature-neutral solution, their bodies supported to eliminate pressure feedback. Communication was limited to scheduled check-ins every 4 hours. The first phase lasted 8 hours. Subjects reported mild discomfort and disorientation. Some experienced difficulty tracking time. Others described fleeting visual impressions, geometric shapes, shifting shadows, easily attributed to sensory deprivation. The data aligned with expectations. At 16 hours, the reports diverged. Several subjects began speaking spontaneously during check-ins, answering questions that had not been asked. One subject apologized repeatedly for interrupting, despite long stretches of silence from the monitoring team. Physiological readings remained stable. At 24 hours, the first anomaly appeared. A subject responded to a prompt that had not yet been delivered. The monitoring technician flagged the incident as coincidence. When it happened again with a different subject, the logs became more careful. By the 30-hour mark, subjects were no longer estimating time incorrectly. They were describing identical intervals. Multiple participants, isolated weeks apart, reported the same sequence. An initial sense of expansion, followed by a compression of awareness into a single point. After that, they described a presence, not auditory, not visual, but structured. It has boundaries, one subject said, like a room that isn't a room. At 40 hours, one subject stopped responding entirely. Vitals were normal. EEG activity remained consistent with wakefulness. Yet he did not acknowledge prompts, alarms, or verbal cues. When removed from the vault, he regained responsiveness within minutes, but could not recall being unresponsive. When asked what occurred, he answered calmly. There was no need to answer anymore. That trial was marked for review. Instead of terminating the program, the exposure limit was extended. The next subject remained in the vault for 56 hours. During extraction, he asked a question that was not recorded in the protocol. Why did you let it finish before I did? The experiment was suspended the same day. The final report cited unanticipated psychological convergence. No further explanation was offered. The vault was sealed, its monitoring equipment removed. The facility itself was not decommissioned, only reassigned. Years later, during a routine inspection, technicians found the vault's internal sensors active. No power source was connected. The system was dismantled shortly after. No replication attempts appear in the record. The experiment was designed to discover what the mind does in the absence of input. What it revealed instead was something quieter. When the world stops speaking to us, the mind does not become empty. It begins to organize itself around something else. And whatever that structure was, the experiment did not attempt to name it. In the early 1970s, sleep research entered a new phase. Electroencephalography had matured. REM cycles were mapped. Circadian rhythms were understood well enough to predict when consciousness should fade and when it should return. Inside a federally funded sleep laboratory, researchers proposed a controlled study to examine extended REM suppression. The objective was modest. They wanted to observe how the brain reorganized itself when normal sleep architecture was disrupted, but not deprived. Subjects would sleep. They simply would not be allowed to enter sustained REM. The protocol was approved. Subjects slept in sealed observation rooms, monitored continuously. Whenever REM onset was detected, the subject was gently awakened. No alarms, no stressors, just enough interruption to prevent the cycle from completing. The first nights proceeded without incident. Subjects reported fatigue, irritability, difficulty concentrating. Cognitive tests showed minor decline, well within projected limits. By the fourth night, something unexpected appeared in the logs. Time perception errors. Subjects consistently underestimated how long they had been awake, not by minutes, but by hours. One subject believed it was the second night when it was already the fifth. Researchers adjusted lighting cues. Clocks were added. The discrepancies persisted. On the seventh night, a subject slept for 6 hours uninterrupted. according to biometric data. But when awakened, he insisted he had not slept at all. EEG records confirmed deep sleep patterns, including brief REM intrusions that the system had failed to interrupt. When shown the data, the subject did not argue. He simply said the sleep had not occurred in sequence. That statement was noted, but not investigated further. By the 10th night, multiple subjects reported the same phenomenon. They described sleeping, but not in order. Fragments of rest appeared disconnected, as if the brain were entering and exiting sleep without continuity. Memory tests revealed gaps that did not correspond to waking periods. Entire intervals were missing. The most significant anomaly occurred on night 14. A subject was recorded entering REM for a continuous span of 90 minutes, far beyond any previous cycle. No interruptions were logged, no system failures detected. Yet when the subject was awakened, he believed only seconds had passed since lying down. More troubling was what followed. Review of the footage revealed a discrepancy between system time and recorded observation. For a period of approximately 47 minutes, the room's internal timestamp advanced, but no video data existed to match it. No blackout, no corruption, just absence. The researchers debated the finding. Some attributed it to equipment desynchronization. Others suggested observer error. The clocks were recalibrated. The systems replaced. The phenomenon did not recur. The experiment ended shortly afterward. Officially, it was concluded that extended REM suppression introduced unacceptable cognitive instability. No further funding was allocated. But one detail remained unresolved. When the final subject was debriefed weeks later, he mentioned something that did not appear in his original report. He remembered waking up during the missing interval, not in the room, but somewhere else. When asked to clarify, he struggled for words. It wasn't a dream, he said. It didn't move forward. There was no follow-up interview, no supplemental analysis. The data was archived as incomplete. The study did not prove that sleep could distort time. It suggested something more limited and more unsettling, that under certain conditions, consciousness may not experience time as a continuous sequence at all. And when that sequence breaks, there may be no internal record of what was lost. In 1978, a behavioral research institute launched a long-duration isolation study designed to answer a narrow question. How stable is personal identity when all social reference is removed? Unlike earlier confinement experiments, this study did not focus on stress tolerance or psychological endurance. The subjects were not interrogated. They were not deprived of sleep or comfort. They were simply removed from all forms of human feedback. Each participant entered a private living unit designed for extended habitation. The rooms were comfortable. Lighting followed a simulated day-night cycle. Food was delivered automatically. Written communication with researchers was allowed, but no names were used. Subjects were instructed not to refer to themselves by name. The reasoning was simple. Researchers wanted to observe cognition without reinforcement from identity labels. No mirrors, no recorded voices, no personal history acknowledged by others. For the first week, subjects complied easily. They wrote daily journals. They described routine thoughts, boredom, minor emotional fluctuations. Psychological evaluations showed no significant deviation from baseline. By the third week, the journals changed. Subjects began omitting pronouns. Instead of "I feel tired," entries read, "There is fatigue." Instead of "I remember," they wrote, "Memory occurred." When questioned, subjects did not appear distressed. They explained the shift as efficiency. The writing felt cleaner, less cluttered. At day 30, a scheduled evaluation revealed a deeper anomaly. Several subjects struggled to answer direct questions about themselves, not because they forgot factual details, but because they no longer experienced those details as belonging to a single continuous entity. One subject paused for several seconds before answering a basic prompt. "Who are you right now?" He replied carefully, "The one writing is still here." Researchers noted the response but did not intervene. The protocol emphasized non-disruption. By day 45, physiological data remained normal, but language patterns across participants had converged. Independent subjects began using identical sentence structures in their journals, despite having no contact with one another. The similarity was flagged as statistically unusual. At day 60, one subject submitted a request. He asked to be released, not due to discomfort, but due to concern. "There is no longer a stable point from which to return," he wrote. The request was denied pending evaluation. The breaking point occurred during a routine exit interview. When asked whether he felt like the same person who had entered the study, the subject hesitated. He said the question assumed continuity. He explained that identity no longer felt like a fixed position, but a temporary arrangement, one that reorganized depending on attention. The interview was terminated early. Within 72 hours, the study was suspended. The final report cited unexpected identity destabilization under prolonged social isolation. No further detail was included. The data was sealed, and the participants were quietly reintegrated. Follow-up assessments were minimal. Years later, one former subject contacted the institute with a single concern. He said he still experienced moments where identity felt optional, not absent, optional. The study did not conclude that isolation destroys the self. It revealed something more subtle, that personal identity may require constant reinforcement, not from the mind alone, but from others. And when that reinforcement is removed long enough, the self does not vanish. It reorganizes into something the experiment was never designed to recognize. By the early 1980s, researchers had already mapped much of the relationship between sound and cognition. Auditory input was known to regulate attention, emotional stability, and spatial awareness. Silence in short durations was considered harmless, even beneficial. The silent room exposure trials were designed to test that assumption. The facility consisted of a single chamber constructed deep within a research complex, insulated beyond anechoic standards. No echoes, no electrical hum, no airflow noise. Even internal bodily sounds were dampened by specialized acoustic materials. Inside the room, silence was not the absence of sound. It was enforced. Subjects entered the chamber for scheduled exposure sessions, beginning at 90 minutes. They were seated comfortably, eyes open, with no tasks assigned. Monitoring occurred through vibration-isolated instruments located outside the chamber. The first sessions produced predictable results. Subjects reported heightened awareness of breathing, heartbeat, minor muscle movement. Some described mild anxiety. Others found the experience calming. At 2 hours, subtle anomalies appeared. Several subjects reported hearing sounds that could not be identified. Not hallucinations, but structured impressions. Rhythmic patterns without tone, pulses without volume. The reports were inconsistent and dismissed. By the 4th hour, the descriptions changed. Subjects no longer reported hearing anything. Instead, they described pressure, as if silence itself had mass. One subject compared it to standing inside a held breath. Physiological readings remained stable. At 6 hours, a subject exited the chamber and failed to respond to verbal prompts for nearly 3 minutes. When he did speak, his voice was measured and flat. He said he had been waiting for silence to finish. That statement was recorded but not addressed. The trials continued. Exposure was extended to 8 hours. This is where the logs begin to thin. One subject described losing the ability to distinguish internal thought from external presence. Another reported that the absence of sound made his thoughts feel louder but not in language, more like spatial pressure. During one session, a subject raised his hand abruptly and asked to leave. When questioned afterward, he explained that the silence had started to feel directional, not surrounding him, approaching. Researchers attempted to correlate the reports with neurological data. EEG readings showed synchronized slowing across multiple brain regions, a pattern rarely observed outside deep meditative states. But the subjects were not meditating. They were listening. At the 9-hour mark, a subject experienced a brief loss of motor coordination upon exiting the chamber. No damage was found. He recovered fully within minutes. What concerned researchers was his explanation. He said movement had felt unnecessary. The trial was marked for review. Before revisions could be implemented, an incident occurred during a routine session. A subject remained in the chamber for the full duration, but did not respond when the door was opened. Vitals were normal. He was conscious, breathing steadily. When spoken to directly, he answered a question that had not been asked. "Now it knows I can hear it," he said. The program was suspended the same day. The final report attributed the termination to unpredictable perceptual effects of prolonged acoustic isolation. No recommendation for further study was included. The chamber was sealed, later dismantled. No replication attempts are documented. The trials did not demonstrate that silence is dangerous. They suggested something narrower. That sound may not simply inform us about the world. It may define the boundary between inner awareness and everything beyond it. And when that boundary dissolves, silence does not remain empty. In the mid-1980s, neuroscience entered an era of precision. Advances in neural stimulation allowed researchers to activate specific regions of the brain with controlled electrical input. The applications were practical, rehabilitation, pain management, recovery from trauma. The long-duration stimulation study was approved to test endurance. Not physical endurance, neurological tolerance. Researchers wanted to know how long targeted stimulation could be sustained before the brain adapted, normalized, or rejected the input. The assumption was simple. With enough time, neural response would plateau. The subjects were fitted with non-invasive cortical stimulators calibrated to low, continuous output. The sensation was mild. Most described it as a gentle pressure or warmth behind the eyes. Initial sessions lasted 2 hours. Reaction times improved. Focus increased. Memory recall sharpened slightly. The data exceeded expectations. The protocol was extended. At 6 hours, subjects reported a fading awareness of the stimulation itself. EEG readings confirmed adaptation. The brain appeared to absorb the signal as baseline activity. This was considered a success. At 12 hours, something unexpected occurred. Several subjects reported a sense of cognitive quiet, not fatigue, not sedation, an absence of internal commentary. Thoughts still formed, but without narration. The effect was subtle and consistent. Researchers debated reducing exposure. Instead, they extended it. By 24 hours, subjects no longer reported the stimulation at all. But when the signal was briefly interrupted during calibration, they reacted immediately. Not with discomfort, with disorientation. One subject asked whether the experiment had ended prematurely. Another requested the signal be restored to maintain continuity. The phrase was noted. At 36 hours, the stimulation was cut completely. The effects were immediate. Subjects did not panic. They did not complain. They simply stopped responding for several seconds longer than expected. Cognitive testing showed delayed initiation, as if the brain were waiting for a cue that did not arrive. One researcher described the behavior as hesitation without confusion. By 48 hours, a subject failed to complete a sentence after the cutoff. He paused, then asked a question that was not part of the protocol. Is this the part where thinking resumes? The study entered review status. Before termination could be formally approved, one final trial was conducted. Stimulation was maintained continuously for 72 hours. During the cutoff phase, biometric data showed no distress. Consciousness remained intact. But subjects consistently described the same sensation. A loss of internal momentum. Thoughts still appeared, but they no longer linked themselves together. There was no progression, no follow-through. When asked to describe the experience, one subject offered a brief explanation. The signal wasn't enhancing thought, he said. It was carrying it. The experiment was halted. Official documentation concluded that extended stimulation produced dependency-like effects on cognitive continuity. The recommendation was clear: no replication. No long-term monitoring followed. The study did not prove that the brain requires external input to function. It suggested something more specific, that under certain conditions, consciousness may outsource part of its continuity and fail to immediately reclaim it when the support is removed. The stimulation did not damage the mind. It replaced something the mind had been quietly doing on its own. In the late 1980s, information overload had become a measurable problem. As data systems grew more complex, researchers began asking how much information the human mind could process without degradation. The cognitive compression study was approved to explore a narrow solution. Could thought be condensed without loss? The premise was technical, not philosophical. Researchers believed that by training subjects to recognize patterns more efficiently, complex decisions could be made faster with fewer intermediate steps. The study took place inside a controlled learning environment. Subjects were presented with increasingly dense information sets, visual data, symbolic sequences, abstract problems, delivered in compressed formats. At first, the results were promising. Subjects adapted quickly. Decision times dropped. Error rates decreased. Cognitive tests showed heightened pattern recognition and reduced cognitive load. The brain appeared to be optimizing. After several weeks, subjects began skipping steps entirely. They could not explain how they reached conclusions, only that the conclusions felt immediate. When asked to describe their reasoning, they struggled. There's nothing to describe, one subject said. It's already done by the time I notice it. Researchers interpreted this as efficiency. Compression protocols were intensified. By the second phase, subjects were exposed to tasks that normally required sequential reasoning. Mathematical proofs, logical chains, strategic planning scenarios. They completed them accurately, but without temporal awareness of the process. EEG data revealed shortened activation windows. Regions associated with deliberation showed reduced engagement, while outcome recognition regions activated almost instantly. One researcher described it as cognition without traversal. At this stage, something unexpected emerged. Subjects began reporting difficulty slowing their thoughts. Not racing thoughts, condensed ones. They described thinking as arriving whole without intermediate structure. Reflection felt unnecessary. Explanation felt artificial. When asked to teach others how they solved problems, subjects could not. The knowledge resisted expansion. By the fourth month, a subtle behavioral shift appeared. Subjects began answering questions before they were finished being asked, not through anticipation, but through assumption. They were often correct. When questioned about this behavior, one subject offered an observation. Questions don't feel like processes anymore, he said. They feel like destinations. The study entered a critical phase when a subject failed a basic reasoning task. Not because he was incorrect, but because he refused to engage with it. He explained that the problem required unfolding, and unfolding no longer felt natural. Cognitive testing revealed an anomaly. Subjects retained compressed reasoning ability, but showed difficulty reconstructing step-by-step logic when required. In some cases, they could not reverse their conclusions. Once thought arrived compressed, it did not easily expand again. The program was halted shortly afterward. The final report cited concerns about irreversible alterations in cognitive sequencing. No recommendation for applied use was made. Follow-up evaluations were limited. One subject later described the lingering effect. He said he still arrived at answers quickly, but felt disconnected from the process of understanding. "I know what's right," he said. "I just don't know how I know it." The cognitive compression study did not demonstrate enhanced intelligence. It revealed a trade-off, that thinking, when stripped of its sequence, may lose something essential. Not accuracy, but comprehension. And once thought no longer unfolds, there may be no clear way back to how understanding used to happen. In the early 1990s, memory research reached an unexpected crossroads. Scientists had mapped how memories were formed, stored, and retrieved at the individual level. What remained unclear was whether memory could be influenced collectively, not through communication, but through structure. The memory synchronization experiment was approved to explore a technical question. If multiple subjects were exposed to identical stimuli under controlled conditions, would their memories remain independent? The study design was rigorous. Subjects were isolated from one another. No shared spaces, no contact before or after sessions. Each participant experienced the same sequence of images, sounds, and narrative prompts delivered in precise timing. The objective was simple: measure variance. Early results were unremarkable. Subjects recalled details differently. Emphasis varied. Emotional responses diverged. The data reflected normal cognitive individuality. After repeated sessions, something subtle appeared. Memory recall began aligning. Not word for word, but structurally. Subjects emphasized the same moments. They paused at the same points. They expressed uncertainty in identical places. When recounting the experience, they often corrected themselves mid-sentence, as if navigating a shared outline. The phenomenon was noted as statistical convergence. The experiment continued. By the third phase, subjects began recalling details that had not been presented explicitly. Transitional moments, implied actions, sequences that existed between stimuli rather than within them. Researchers initially attributed this to inference, but the inferences matched. Independent subjects, interviewed separately, described the same imagined intervals with striking similarity. Even phrasing converged, despite efforts to randomize interview prompts. At this point, the research team introduced control variations. Stimuli were altered slightly for select participants. The order was changed. Minor elements were removed. The outcome was unexpected. Subjects whose stimuli differed still recalled the original version. When confronted with discrepancies, they did not resist. They adjusted their recollections to match what they felt was supposed to be there. One subject explained it carefully. "It feels wrong to remember it differently," she said, "like the memory has a shape." That comment marked a shift. The researchers were no longer observing memory recall. They were observing memory alignment. By the final phase, subjects displayed hesitation when recalling the experience alone. They spoke more confidently when they believed others were recalling it as well, despite having no contact. Confidence increased in proportion to perceived shared memory. One subject, during debriefing, asked a question not listed in the protocol. Are we remembering this, or are we agreeing to it? The experiment was suspended shortly afterward. The official report framed the findings as a form of cognitive conformity. Social influence was cited, despite the absence of social interaction. The data was archived without further exploration. No replication attempts appear in subsequent literature. Years later, a follow-up interview was conducted with a former participant. He reported something that had not diminished with time. He could no longer remember the experience alone. Whenever he tried, the memory felt incomplete, as if missing its alignment with others. The memory synchronization experiment did not demonstrate shared memory in the conventional sense. It revealed something narrower, that under certain conditions, memory may not function as a private record. It may behave like a structure that expects reinforcement. And when that reinforcement is absent, recall itself becomes unstable. By the mid-1990s, neuroscience had grown confident in its definitions. Consciousness was understood as a fluctuating state. Attention rose and fell. Awareness faded during sleep, anesthesia, trauma. No human mind, according to accepted models, could remain continuously conscious without interruption. The extended consciousness hold was designed to test the upper boundary of that assumption. The study was conducted in a clinical research environment under strict supervision. Subjects were selected for exceptional neurological stability and trained in attentional control techniques. No stimulants were used, no sensory deprivation, no altered states were induced. The goal was narrow. Researchers wanted to observe how long uninterrupted wakeful awareness could be sustained before the brain forced a transition into sleep, dissociation, or micro-unconscious lapses. Initial sessions lasted 12 hours. Subjects remained alert, coherent, responsive. EEG patterns showed normal fatigue markers. Nothing unexpected. At 24 hours, the first deviation appeared. Subjects did not report exhaustion. Instead, they described a thinning of mental contrast. Thoughts still occurred, but without emphasis. Emotional responses flattened. Time perception slowed, though clocks confirmed continuity. The researchers labeled the effect attentional smoothing. The study continued. At 48 hours, subjects began reporting an unusual sensation. They no longer felt as though they were maintaining consciousness. Consciousness appeared to be maintaining itself. When asked to clarify, one subject said the effort had disappeared. Awareness felt static, not active, not passive, simply present. EEG data showed a sustained plateau, rarely observed outside deep meditative states. Yet the subjects were not meditating. They were speaking, moving, responding to prompts. The researchers extended the hold. By 72 hours, something critical occurred. Subjects stopped describing time as a sequence. Past and future references blurred. When asked how long they had been awake, responses varied wildly. Not from confusion, but from indifference. One subject answered, "Long enough that it doesn't matter anymore." Physiological indicators showed stress. Cortisol levels rose. Heart rates fluctuated. But awareness did not collapse. The breaking point arrived at 96 hours. During a routine cognitive assessment, a subject paused for several seconds before responding. Not because he was tired, but because the question required a transition. From presence into response. He later explained that answering felt like an interruption. "It pulls you out of it," he said, "out of staying." The phrase was noted. Shortly afterward, multiple subjects requested termination. Not out of distress, out of concern, they reported difficulty re-entering ordinary thought patterns. Language felt intrusive. Decisions felt abrupt. The continuity they were holding did not dissolve naturally when rest was introduced. The study was halted. The final report concluded that extended uninterrupted awareness produced destabilizing effects on cognitive reintegration. Consciousness, it stated, was not meant to be sustained without oscillation. Follow-up evaluations were brief. One subject described a lasting after effect. He said that moments of ordinary awareness now felt fragmented, as if everyday consciousness was constantly dropping in and out of something larger. "I don't think we're supposed to stay there," he said, "but I don't think we're supposed to forget it either." The extended consciousness hold did not redefine awareness. It exposed a boundary. That consciousness may not be something we generate continuously. It may be something that appears and disappears for a reason. And when that cycle is held open too long, returning may not be as simple as closing your eyes. In the late 1990s, a multidisciplinary research team proposed a final study meant to unify several unresolved findings. Previous experiments had isolated cognition, perception, memory, and awareness. This trial was designed to observe what happened when those systems were engaged simultaneously without pushing any single variable to an extreme. The design was conservative. Subjects were placed in a controlled environment with normal lighting, stable temperature, minimal noise, and standard daily routines. They slept, ate, exercised, and communicated with staff. Nothing was removed, nothing was enhanced. The only difference was continuity. For the duration of the trial, every variable was kept constant, no schedule changes, no environmental shifts, no novelty introduced. The intent was to observe baseline consciousness over extended sameness. Researchers wanted to see how the mind behaved when nothing demanded adjustment. The first week produced no notable data. Subjects reported boredom, minor irritability, familiar cognitive drift, all expected. By the second week, subtle changes emerged. Subjects reported difficulty marking time, not because they were disoriented, but because days felt indistinguishable. Memory logs showed increasing compression. Events from separate days merged into single recollections. Researchers identified this as temporal blending. The protocol continued. By week 3, subjects began skipping journal entries. Not out of resistance, they explained there was nothing new to record. When asked to reflect anyway, their descriptions lacked sequence. Experiences were listed without order or emphasis. At week 4, a subject made an observation during a routine check-in. "It feels like the system has stopped refreshing," he said. The phrase was logged. Physiological data remained normal. At week 5, researchers noticed a change in response latency. Subjects took longer to answer questions, not because of confusion, but because the questions seemed to require re-entry into a mode they were no longer inhabiting. One subject explained it carefully. "Responding feels like stepping out," he said, "out of the state the room keeps us in." The researchers debated intervention. They chose not to. The breaking point occurred during a scheduled cognitive assessment. A subject was asked to recall a recent event. He paused, then asked a question in return. "Do you want it as it happened," he asked, "or as it exists now?" Clarification was requested. He explained that events no longer felt finished. They persisted as ongoing states, without clear boundaries between before and after. Shortly afterward, multiple subjects reported similar experiences. They did not feel distressed. They felt uninterrupted. The research team convened an emergency review. The concern was not psychological harm, but harm, but reversibility. Early attempts to reintroduce variation, altered schedules, new stimuli, produced agitation rather than normalization. Subjects struggled to resegment experience. The trial was terminated. The official report stated that extended environmental constancy produced unanticipated continuity effects incompatible with cognitive reintegration. No recommendation for further study was included. No replication was approved. The data was archived. Years later, one researcher reflected privately on why the study was never repeated. It wasn't because it failed. It was because it removed something science depends on: change. The trial that was never repeated did not reveal a hidden danger. It revealed a possibility that the human mind may rely on disruption to remain structured. And when experience is allowed to continue without interruption, consciousness may stop dividing itself into moments, not because something breaks, but because nothing does. Each of these experiments began with structure, clear objectives, defined parameters, established models for how the human mind was expected to behave. Nothing about their beginnings suggested danger. What ended them was not failure. It was continuity. In every case, the systems worked. The data was collected. The subjects remained conscious, stable, and responsive. But something emerged that did not fit into the language of results. Awareness without reference, memory without sequence, identity without reinforcement, thought without progression. These experiments did not collapse under pressure. They reached a point where continuation no longer produced answers, only states. And science by design does not study states that cannot be exited cleanly. So the programs were stopped. The facilities were reassigned. The data was archived, not because the findings were disproven, but because they could not be concluded. What these trials suggest is not that the human mind is fragile. It may be the opposite. It may be capable of operating beyond the structures we rely on to observe it. Time, language, sequence, change. Those structures do not define consciousness. They contain it. And when those containers are held open too long or removed entirely, something unfamiliar appears. Not chaos, continuity. Archive 9 does not claim that these experiments discovered a hidden truth. They document something more restrained. Moments where inquiry reached a condition it was not built to measure. And instead of forcing an answer, it stopped. The question remains, how many conclusions are missing? Not because they were erased, but because understanding them required letting go of the very tools we use to understand anything at all? This is Archive 9, and some experiments do not end when they are terminated. They end when we decide not to continue looking.